is Jenna Reedy. She is the Chief of Staff at rabbittransit, a regional transportation provider. She joined rabbittransit in May of 2006, and in September 2018, she became the Chief of Staff, serving as the Director of External Affairs and Business Strategy. She is responsible for executing the Executive Director's vision and works towards creating a culture of innovative and best practices aligned with the authority's mission of mobility. Prior to joining rabbittransit, Jenna was the Director of Marketing for an independent public television network serving the Washington, D.C. market with content from around the world. Jenna has previously worked for a variety of nonprofit organizations, including the George Washington University. She holds a BA in communications from the University of Pittsburgh and is originally from York, Pennsylvania. Thank you, Jenna.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to present today. And as mentioned, my name is Jenna Reedy, Chief of Staff at rabbittransit. So I'll kick us off today, starting with a little history. So as you can see, now obviously I won't go through this all, but as you can see, we are approaching 50. So in 2024, we'll be 50 years old. We were originally incorporated by the county commissioners through the Municipalities Act of 1945 and have had a varied history since 74. As you can see, we've gone through several different name changes through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and finally landed on rabbittransit in 2000. So our brand is over 20 years old, which is amazing. In 2011, we merged with Adams County and became the coordinator for Northumberland. 2015, Cumberland County. 2016, we actually became the Central Pennsylvania Transportation Authority and added a number of counties to the fold, bringing it to 10. And at this point, our service area footprint is the size of Connecticut. In 2018, we began a management agreement with Capital Area Transit and have held that for 3 years. 2020 became the administrator for Indiana County. We do not offer service in Indiana County. We are simply the administrator. And in 2021, we are on the verge of regionalization. And this has been going on for quite some time, for many years. We have, I believe, arrived. And I can tell you that for the 2021, this year has been known, the word of the year is systemness. Now, we've, in all confessions here, we've borrowed it from the healthcare industry, but we have really adopted it for this past year in 2021. And really, it's the interconnected elements of to function as one, and that has really defined both organizations and blending them into one system over the past year. So why regionalization? So, honestly, there's a host of benefits that tie to regionalization. These are listing several. There is an economy of scale that comes with it. We've prevented service reduction in Harrisburg through just greater efficiencies and shared resources. We're able to leverage specialty areas. There is IT expertise in one area. We have one marketing campaign that we can deploy rather than have two marketing departments. We have shared resources. I know when we first came together, there was great interest in the paint booth that CAT has. So it's been just a great past year, 3 years really, and we're looking at best practices to adopt across both entities. And as you can see, there's a host of different experience that we can leverage in one direction or the other. So service in the region, this is really our fixed route footprint for both entities, connecting major hubs, Hanover to York, York to Harrisburg, Harrisburg to Shippensburg. And really the ultimate goal is to create seamless connection for the region. And I'll chat a little bit more about that later. Moving back toward the benefits conversation, it's looking at the region holistically, making it attractive to larger employers for economic development. We have recently entertained relationships with employers who are interested in pulling talent from both the York and the Harrisburg areas. We have robust veterans transportation that I'll talk a little bit more about later, but really connecting to employment opportunities. Next slide, please. as the healthcare systems move more toward regional models, and really we've seen different offices open up cross county lines. It speaks to this need for connected service and working within these larger boundaries. Certainly connectivity to higher education. We serve the whole HAC network, which is a regional base. So really looking at all of the benefits and the idea of regionalization, it brings us to introducing the Susquehanna Regional Transportation Authority, SRTA. Now I can tell you this is just a draft logo. Branding is a hot topic at the moment. So stay tuned for that. We're still debating and having conversations about that, what that might transpire and look like for the future. So the service area of SRTA, we are looking at 5 municipalities, and you'll notice those in gray. So it's Adams, Cumberland, Dauphin, York County, and then obviously the Harrisburg, city of Harrisburg being within Dauphin County. So those are 5 of the authorities that comprise the SRTA. We have one board member who says finally that no representation without taxation. So these are the local match contributions from these counties that comprise SRTA, and the other 7 counties represented that you'll see in yellow, those we still do have oversight of, but through management agreements. So the governance for SRTA, there's a lot of conversation about, what are the factors? What does governance look like? There was much discussion about a variety of factors, and we've ultimately landed on these 4. So it's population, local match contribution, the monthly ridership, and also the fixed route miles. So currently it's a 10-person board. You'll note the board votes at the very bottom based on these 4 factors. And if you're doing quick math, this actually leverages, this totals to 11. So Franklin County is currently the ex officio, and we hope to bring them on board as a member of the authority as we move toward a fixed route service, or a model that's something similar that would require the local match contribution. So ultimately, we do envision 11 members. The current structure, as you can see, SRTA is really the umbrella, but we have preserved CAT and the Central Pennsylvania Transportation Authority. We do business as Rabbit Transit. We've preserved those underneath, and this is where our collective bargaining agreements are held. So the CBAs remain intact with each organization, and we will preserve those as part of this new structure. A couple different questions that have come up from stakeholders in the past when we've talked about regionalization. What about the funding? Will funding in one county be spent in another? No, the FTA funds that are spent in the urbanized area, the UZA, those funds must be spent in those locations. So the only difference is really administrative cost, which can be allocated across all cost centers. Similarly, the drivers will also only report to the assigned areas. So there's cross utilization where it makes sense if you're near county lines, but ultimately the operators will stay within the assigned areas. And then lastly, will it affect our CBAs? And no, they will remain negotiated separately and maintained within those 2 organizations. So that's about regionalization and the benefits thereof, but I wanted to also update you about our public transit specifics that are currently happening or have happened in the recent future. So CAT 2021, this was launched in September of 2021, and really this is a service redesign. There was a study, there was a redesign, and it was really the first comprehensive assessment in 45 years of this system. So it was a 2-year process with the pandemic. There were open house meetings, ultimately stakeholder events, and the redesign was specifically focused on fixed route, and it worked to streamline service within Cumberland, Dauphin, and the city of Harrisburg, and really to gain operating efficiencies. So in terms of infrastructure, we have some current projects. Our King Street Station renovations, our downtown York Transfer Center, at King Street and Pershing Avenue, we're currently in the midst of those renovations now. It's interesting, we received feedback from many of our passengers with disabilities, particularly those who were visually impaired, that they experienced difficulty navigating the platform. There were different textures of stamped concrete, there were excessive pillars, And so in addition, the pillars created poor line of sight from a security perspective. So our new design, our new renovations seek to address all of those areas. In addition, we needed to have a greater roof clearance with the additional the addition of our CNG vehicles, which are much higher than the standard our standard fixed route vehicles. So we're hoping for a completion date of January or February of this year, fingers crossed. We are encountering, as you may imagine, some supply chain disruption. So we are certainly hopeful. The project on the bottom is the Market Square Transfer Center. This is a project that was in coordination with PennDOT and the mayor's office and was really focused on safety improvements. The additions include signals and signage. There's ADA ramps, a new crosswalk at the 2nd Street driveway, updated loading zones, laning rails, new bus shelters, and most importantly, one of the most important is the illuminated pedestrian warning signals that they were added to indicate that a bus may be approaching. So we're really incredibly encouraged and thrilled with the safety improvements to this area, which took place, probably finished completion in about May of this past year. Middletown parking. So currently I know PennDOT is in the midst of constructing a new train station on the Keystone Corridor in Middletown, and CAT will actually be overseeing the parking management and maintenance responsibility of the train station on behalf of PennDOT. So the current train station has 75 spaces. It's moving toward approximately 367 spaces, and this will be an electronic parking management system. I believe the lot is expected to be completed around December, if I'm not mistaken. So we look forward to the new initiative on our end. The I-81 Employer Forum. So, as you can imagine, the Harrisburg and Chambersburg 81 corridor continues to experience substantial growth, and as does the warehouse and distribution sector. The employer transportation needs are growing. We're receiving more from employees, and really just wanted to attempt to gain insight into understanding what the specific needs are. So we conducted an employer survey for I-81 and also hosted a forum surrounding this corridor to really work through the different conversations. And it's no surprise that nearly 60% of the respondents indicated that their company needs expanded public transit. And more than half of the respondents indicated that prospective new employees, transportation is being identified as a work barrier, as a barrier to arriving at their location. So, the question becomes, can employers and transit better coordinate and better collaborate? And we've had a lot of great conversations. Previously we've struggled when employers had either mandatory overtime, swing shifts. Employers within the same industrial park would have just a plethora of different shift times, and just a real struggle to create a fixed schedule with all of those different variations. So we've moved toward a good dialogue. I think people are willing to listen and to be adaptive and to have the conversation about how can we work together. And this was a good testament to that. Microtransit, we, as of December 13th, we're launching our latest microtransit service. It's called the Stop Hopper in Northumberland County. And this is the Selinsgrove. You'll see the picture on the left, the Sunbury Selinsgrove zone. And so microtransit is really an on-demand service. It's app-based. It offers point-to-point transportation, but within a designated zone. So we piloted microtransit in York a couple of years ago, and interestingly, it was the only service that saw growth during the pandemic. Everything else, every other mode that we encountered was decreasing, and microtransit was on the rise. The picture to the right, Franklin County, we will be launching microtransit in Franklin, specifically Chambersburg with the industrial park, and looking at 2022 for that service. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. The Gettysburg-Hanover Connector, this is another relatively new service. This was in February of 2021, and it really originally was launched as part of the governor's workforce development pilot. This seeks to link the communities of Gettysburg and Hanover. It's via New Oxford that was previously not served by fixed route. The New Oxford corridor was not. And so it connects these two different communities and the hopes for increased workforce development and employment opportunities. And I can tell you that it was really a collaborative effort with the community. The At Home Coalition in Adams County is focused specifically on the sectors of transportation, housing, and employment, and where can we connect those, in addition to the Adams County Community Foundation. So these two groups were instrumental in steering this conversation and helping to advance the project. So Rabbit Cares, which is formerly known as 3P Ride, this is Rabbit Transit's 501c3 charitable foundation. Over the years, we've had different entities want to contribute with financial contributions, and we're not as comfortable with it's a bit more obscure tax code that would still made it tax deductible, but they just really did not recognize that. I think it's a 701c. And so ultimately we formed our own 501c3 charity. And this really provides funding for those populations that fall through the cracks and really outside of traditional funding resources. There's three focus areas: the veterans transportation, food access, and access to care. And through a series of grants, veterans grants, and also larger donations from companies, we're able to provide transportation to veterans at no cost, not only for medical appointments, but most recently for employment. We provide a pass for a job interview. There's 4 months of transportation during employment. So, if you know veterans or even have contacts at veterans agencies, please send them our way. We would love to get the word out about this program and further connect with them. I would be remiss if I did not recognize our driver efforts during the pandemic. As essential employees, we have been there since the very beginning. They have been on the front lines. And as you'll note, Josh and his full PPE garb, we transported positive COVID patients in the very beginning. The picture on the left are the COVID testing sites. And we also really transported food packages to those who were quarantining and really couldn't to be on the vehicles and get out and who still needed assistance. So on the horizon, we're hopeful for a microtransit model in the capital region. We've launched one in the suburban model. We are currently launching the rural model, and we really seek to develop a model in the urban area that's underutilized for fixed route. So that is the next focus for microtransit. Seamless fares, I talked a little bit about the desire to have a seamless connection, and we want the experience to be as painless as possible crossing county lines. So having the same fare type, the same fare media, where it makes sense, just making it as seamless as possible. And then obviously, as we've heard about the Great Resignation and the recruitment and the retention of employees, improving employer quarters is absolutely critical. We ourselves are currently facing employee shortages, staffing shortages, and so really need to still continue to lean into this area, as we are not alone in that situation. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions that come up.
Thank you very much for that presentation and overview of the Rabbit Transit operations. Our next speaker is Andy Batson. Andy serves as the Chief of Planning and Project Delivery Division within PennDOT's Bureau of Public Transportation. In his role, Andy is responsible for leading statewide transit planning and technology projects, as well as delivering an annual capital program of more than $500 million. In this role, he manages consultant planning, environmental, design, and construction management contracts, and guides projects from idea through construction. Andy previously served as the division chief for urban transportation, and prior to joining PennDOT, led the multimodal transportation planning group and a private consulting firm in the Harrisburg area. Andy, if you'd like to begin your presentation.
I wanted to say first how honored I am to speak after Jenna. I don't think, maybe you do, maybe you don't understand how much rapid transit does for our region, and it's amazing how many different new ideas they come up with and to serve the community in the central Pennsylvania region. And they are regularly held up nationally as an example of innovative and new ways to do it. So I'm honored she was able to be here, and I get to go after her with something much more boring, but I'm glad to be there. And I just want to share one other personal note. So WTS was, I started thinking back this morning. I think the first event I ever did in this industry was a WTS Lunch and Learn seminar on public transportation. So it's kind of full circle for me to be able to talk to you all again here today. So what we're going to talk about is a Building Better Bus Stops resource guide. So I'll get into the background and details, but I hope that this is something that y'all find informational and can take and apply at your jobs, regardless of what they may be. So you'll see on the screen in front of you there some pretty typical pictures throughout Pennsylvania of bus stops. And there's some things circled that I hope that you can see there, but it's pretty typical, right? You have the one in the upper right-hand corner, that's this shelter that's on an island. There's no sidewalks, there's no way to get there. You're walking in the grass or the snow or the mud or whatever it may be. You'll see in the far ground there, it's just a post, same situation on the other side of the intersection. I don't think there's any crossing signals here. I don't think there's anything there to help people get there. You also see in the lower right hand, you just see that sign stuck on a berm in the side of the road. There doesn't appear to be a shoulder on that side. There's no way for people to get there. And then on the left, you have other instances where we're abandoning people in parking lots. So that's pretty typical around the country. It's especially an issue in Pennsylvania, just the way that we've developed. And it's something that we started working with the Pennsylvania Public Transportation Association a couple of years ago to see if we could provide some additional resources for a variety of groups to help start to solve that problem bit by bit. So what we're talking about today is the Building Better Bus Stops resource guide, which is a mouthful, but we developed that, as I said, there's been this increasing interest. People have started to recognize that access to public transportation is as important as the public transportation itself. If you can't get to a bus stop or a train stop or whatever you're trying to get to, it's pretty worthless. They don't operate in vacuums. We also found that there really isn't much out there. There's some pretty good resources for large urban areas in Pennsylvania. DVRPC has a great one for SEPTA, and in Pittsburgh Region Port Authority has a great one. But in between, which is the majority of Pennsylvania, obviously, and that suburban and rural application especially, there really isn't that much there either here or nationally. So that was really what we were trying to solve. So I wanted to just say what it is and what it isn't. The resource guide, first of all, it's available to everyone. It's on PPTA's website. It's on our website, and I can provide links, I think at the beginning, but it'll be at the end too. It's resources and tools and best practices. It is not requirements. It's not a design manual. It's not a publication. It's not a clearance transmittal. It's nothing. It is a book of resources and tools so that people can make better decisions and do better work in regards to access to transit in their communities. It has a couple different sections, which we'll talk about. And really what we tried to do was provide those tools and resources to different organizations, recognizing that it really takes a village to make these things happen. It's not the transit agency, it's not the district, it's not the municipality, it's everybody involved to make this happen. And again, as I said, we really focused it on what is the majority of Pennsylvania land coverage, at least, which is that suburban and rural areas where we saw a pretty significant gap in any type of useful resources and tools in that area. So you can see there, I'll skip through that. So the resource guide has three main parts and then kind of an ancillary document. So there's planning and policy resources, which I'll go over at a high level. Those are geared towards municipalities and how they can set the stage for successful bus stops and access to transit designs. The second part is really geared more towards professionals and practitioners and transit agencies, and it has design resources. So it really talks about what's the appropriate way to design a bus stop and what are some things you should consider when you're doing it. And then the third part talks about bus stop typologies. And that really starts to break down, recognizing that there are different environments where we find bus stops and what are the appropriate ways or what are some good ideas and how you plan and design a bus stop for those particular areas. So we'll get into that too. And that really gets to home part of another reason that we even developed this. I'm sure you're all well aware of the facilities, the distribution centers, the Amazon warehouses, the other large scale million square foot plus facilities that are popping up all around Pennsylvania, and especially in our area. Well, it's become pretty common that these places open, and then 3 weeks later they're calling the transit agency and they need transit service because they need 100 employees to go from downtown Harrisburg or downtown York out to Carlisle, and they didn't build their parking lots that a bus will fit. And it's too late at that point. So that's part of the reason that typology is in there, recognizing that it takes all different kinds of approaches to make it successful. So again, it is a village. Everybody has to participate to make this happen. So going into the planning and policy resources section, you know, the important thing to understand, and I think many of you do this already, intrinsically know that there's a link between public transportation and land use. Public transportation at the end of the day is getting people from here to there. It's the same as any public transportation. So there's an origin and a destination, and that is what land use is. So incorporating positive land use relationships between transit is incredibly important. And the guide talks about why incorporating transit when you're making land use decisions at the municipal level and at the county level can have a very large positive impact. So we also started talking about what are opportunities to incorporate public transit into planning. So it's getting better. I think people are starting to recognize the importance, but a lot of times it's done a little bit in a vacuum. There'll be a special district plan, there'll be a transit plan, there'll be something that's very specifically oriented towards that. Perhaps it is incorporated into the active transportation plans, but it really belongs everywhere. So your comprehensive plans, your zoning ordinances, you'll see the subdivision and land development ordinances, any document where you're talking about people, land uses, and transportation really should have a public transportation component to make sure that people are thinking about it. Because at the end of the day, it's always very difficult to do something after the fact. If you think about it in advance, it's a lot easier to incorporate it. And at the end of that section, which I think we're most proud of, or I'm most proud of, is we developed some model ordinances that municipalities can adopt to facilitate that building better bus stop process. We actually have started to hear in the last few months, we have some municipalities that have started to adopt it. I know in our area, I think Susquehanna Township's considering it. Out in the Philadelphia region, there's a couple of townships in Montgomery County, I believe, that were planning on adopting it this month, hopefully. So it's really starting to gain some traction. It's pretty exciting to see, and it helps our jobs too when it's laid out in an ordinance in the saldo that here's what you need to do, here's what you need to consider when you're doing development planning. And there's also a plan review checklist for people that do plan reviews, and that could be some of you in your jobs, it could be municipalities, it could be city engineers, et cetera, to look at plan reviews and answer some questions about whether public transit has been considered and incorporated into any of those plans. So next section, we'll go into the design resources portion of it, which I personally find fascinating. Just bus stops seem so simple, but there's so many things to consider, and there's so many complicating factors that make it one of the most difficult things we do. We'll do, $60 million facilities, but a $10,000 bus stop we spend as much work on. It's pretty crazy to think about. So we borrow these guidelines or these principles from Memphis, but we think that they really apply to Pennsylvania and what we're trying to do. So bus stops should be accessible to everyone. It should be safe, convenient, and comfortable locations. So we'll talk about locations. It should be easy to see. You should know where they are. You should know how to use them. It should be safe and a good experience for pedestrians accessing it or bicyclists accessing it. And it should be integrated into the surroundings. So you're not building on an island. It communicates with the land uses around it. And also, we'll talk a little bit about it, but the guide really talks about amenities. And there's a hierarchy of amenities. If there's 3 people a day that use it, you don't need a bench and a trash can and everything else. But if it's 50, 100 people a day, it makes it a lot different. So it really talks about how amenities can make a big difference, and they support the operations rather than detract from it. So bus stop locations, and I'm going through this quickly just because everybody's over their lunch break here, but I'm happy to talk to anybody offline if you want to get to it. But bus stop locations is incredibly important. We showed those issues. A lot of those problems at the beginning are just where we decided to put it. I say we globally as the transit industry or the municipality, but it's where we put it. Maybe didn't think about the land use or who's riding it or how they're going to use it or how it's going to operate. All of those things need to be considered when you look at where you're going to place it. And the other thing is, especially as we look into traffic design and into more of the site civil design, is looking at, how is a bus going to use it? We sometimes think only about the sidewalk portion of it or the passenger portion, but a big vehicle has to access it. So looking at how it accesses it and how it interacts with the areas around it, making sure you don't block a driveway when a bus stops. If there's an issue and the ramp breaks, you want to make sure that you didn't block the business behind it and they can't get in and out of their parking lot for 20 minutes. And how do you encourage other things, curb management, bicycle lane access, those types of things. So the guide really gets into that. We also spend a lot of time talking about the location of bus stops themselves related to intersections and how that can make a pretty significant difference on the safety of it and how people use it. And I just showed, there's 3 different types. There's a far side, a near side, and a mid block, but they all have different elements on how you successfully design and safely design for it and how it interacts with the street and the parking around it that should be considered. So again, that's all in the resource guide. I won't get into the nitty-gritty, but all pretty fascinating stuff. And there's, again, different types of stops, curb extensions, pull-out lanes, curbside, and all of these things have different implications. So I want to take just a minute and go over this one in a little bit more detail. And we spent a lot of time talking about the basics of bus stops. And that seems simple, but there are a lot of elements you can see on the screen. This is 6 or 8, I guess, elements that you need to consider whenever you're designing a bus stop. And you have to look at each of them independently, but together as a system too. So there's the basic American Disability Act requirements. So you have to have a loading pad like you can see there, and that makes sure that people can get on and off the bus in a safe way. Most buses now have ramps. They used to have them in the back of the buses. You'll probably see older buses that have them in the back, but nowadays it's kind of integrated with the bottom step. So it just folds out from the door, and that's how people with wheelchairs or just individuals who have a hard time stepping up can use the ramp. But you have to make sure that you have enough space that can safely deploy and people can move around it to be able to get back on the vehicle. Informational signs is incredibly important. There's some in MUTCD, but there's also, it's really just an informational passenger sign. So the elements you include there really impact the user experience. Then, as you get to have more people that use it, you may need a shelter, a bench, other amenities. There's all very specific requirements. You should always check the latest ADA regulations. A lot of that's in public right-of-way accessibility guide, and but there's other resources out there from the federal government that you should check first. And then a lot of things that people forget, you'll see kind of 4 or 5 and a little bit of 8. That really talks about the clear zone. So people will build these things, but they'll put them right up against the sidewalk. And then if someone's walking past the bus shelter, how do they do it? It's blocked now, they can't get to it. Or if you're in a wheelchair, how do you get around these fixed objects? And I can't tell you how many times, we go out to places and it's this great bus stop and there's this shelter, but then there's a light pole right in front of the shelter. And then if you're in a wheelchair, there's no way for you to get through there. So you're off-roading somewhere to make sure you can get around it. And then finally, and not to belabor this slide, but the clear zones for rear doors. And this is something that I think is incredibly important and to think about. In the pandemic, we really started to see agencies try to avoid personal interactions. So they tried to push people to board on the rear door so that they weren't in close proximity to the driver. They weren't handing cash. They weren't having that interaction with hundreds of people a day. So it protects the driver, but it also protects the passenger. But a lot of people that only designed the front portion of the station, the stop, forgot that the back door exists sometimes. And now we have no accessible boarding area from the back. We have people are getting let off in mud or gravel or there's nothing there. And it's only a difference of, 18, 20 feet. But it makes a significant difference when you're a rider trying to use the bus stop. And this just goes over some more of that information. And then I did want to do this, and maybe Jenna, during the questions and answers, can talk about it a lot more because we borrowed this picture. But there's other amenities that make bus stops attractive that you should think about when you're designing or planning for them. The one on the right, she knows all the details on it, but I think it is the coolest thing I've ever seen. In York, they did this play area bus stop, and it really gives the people that need to use the bus there something for them to do. So the kids can play. You'll see it's kind of like a playground equipment set. I think it was in partnership with an organization that Jenna knows about, but I know that they've done a lot of write-ups on it, and they found that people will actually walk from further away in the city to use that bus stop, even though they're on the same route. They'll pass the stop right by their house and walk to this one. And it really just provides a safe way for people to use transit and makes them want to be there rather than feeling like they have to be there. And then the last part in that section just talks about the really difficult part, the agreements, the rights and permissions. What do you need to sign? Who do you need to talk to? And then how do you maintain it? It's always easy to put relatively easy to put it in, but then you have to keep it going for 10 plus years. So it really gets into those details. And the final section is this bus stop typologies. And that goes through, as I talked about, each of those individual cases, some use cases where you may find them and what a shelter should look like. And it pulls from the previous slide you saw with all the 9 or 8 elements. And you can see there's the one on the left that I spoke about a suburban stop within a site. So that could be a big box retailer, it could be an Amazon warehouse, it could be a distribution center, you never know. But what do they need to be considering when they build those facilities, and how can we review plans in a way or design the site civil in a way that it encourages transit use rather than makes it more difficult? And that goes through a whole bunch of other use cases that we may see around Pennsylvania. I just wanted to end with, how does it impact you? I know, WTS is great because it really brings people in. They're, loosely affiliated with the transportation industry, but it could be environmental, it could be a designer, it could be a planner. I'm sure there's other things I'm missing, but everybody has a role to play. So the first thing is consider your community's needs and be a little bit of an advocate for it. Ask the question, does transit go here today? Should it go there? And I think we can do that in all phases of a transportation project, but we can also just do it in our everyday lives too. We don't need to be, militant advocates or anything like that, but just asking the question sometimes goes a long way because people don't always think about it. And if you do that and you use the resources that are out there and start to really ask those questions, I think that it'll really start to build those partnerships and help improve bus stops across the state.
Thank you very much on behalf of WTS to our speakers and each of you for supporting WTS and joining us today. If we don't talk to you soon, have a good and happy holiday. Thank you very much.